Okay, so coming back with another video here, continuing with 1.1, you will notice then that when I provide these video lectures, what I'm providing are a number of short lectures, usually in the 10 to 15-minute range or less than that, because studies have shown that it's easier to retain information if you can take it in short bursts. So here we are, just continuing with 1.1, and you can, of course, follow along with the PowerPoint slides that I assume you've downloaded at this point, so you can be taking notes alongside what I'm presenting here. And what I'm going to be doing now is just provide examples of the concepts that I was just talking about here, dealing with the concept of an argument as a set of statements, one of which is supposed to be supported by the others, and also what might separate arguments from non-arguments. I will note that I know your textbook is expensive, right? But I will note that one of the things I like about it is the fact that Patrick Hurley, again, the author of that textbook, has provided lots and lots of examples in that book to illustrate the points that he's talking about. I think those are extremely helpful. I hope that my examples will be helpful as well in terms of helping you to grasp the concepts that we're dealing with. I would also say that, as you know, you get to use a note sheet for each of the 4 exams in this class. And if there are examples that I cover or that you find in the textbook that you find particularly illuminative, right, helpful, you think that they provide you with the right idea about what's going on with a particular concept, I'd strongly encourage you to put some examples on your note sheet to help you with those exams. So, having said all that, let's look at this. All marmots are mammals. Fido is a marmot, so he must be a mammal. Okay? So just by the way, a little preview here. The early theme of the course, the earliest theme of the course will be marmots, as you see here. And then we're going to, of course, move on to unicorns, right? So stay tuned for the unicorns. At any rate, all marmots are mammals. Fido is a marmot, so he must be a mammal is our first example. And here's another one of a short passage. Are you going to San Francisco next summer? San Francisco is a larger city than Seattle, but in the summer, even more people come to the city. It's about 900 miles from here. Okay, so these are 2 short passages, and we can think about a couple of questions with regard to them. First of all, we can ask how many statements are in each. Now, we'll see here in the first example that, of course, there are 2 sentences in that example. We see the period occur twice. But if you think about it, there are actually 3 statements in that example. We've got all marmots are mammals, Fido is a marmot, and he, Fido, must be a mammal, would be our third statement within that passage. We look at the second example. Of course, I'm hoping we can all recognize that the first sentence here, which ends in a question mark, right, that would not be a statement, it's a question. So we jump to San Francisco is a larger city than Seattle, that's a statement. In the summer, even more people come to the city is another statement. And it, that is San Francisco, is about 900 miles from here would be our third statement. So again, I think we can say in both of these cases we are dealing with 3 statements. Now, and a more important question is whether or not some of those statements support others within that passage. In other words, looking at the first example here, is there one of these 3 statements that is being supported by the other 2? That is, there evidence provided for it. I think if we pause, and you can literally, of course, do this on the video, but if we pause and think about this, we can recognize that Fido must be a mammal is being supported by these 2 other statements, all marmots are mammals and Fido is a marmot. So we can actually conclude here that that first example is an example of an argument. It's a set of statements, one of which is supposed to be supported by the others. We will also notice, I would think, that that's not a particularly exciting example, right? It's not controversial or anything like this, but nonetheless, because it fits our definition of an argument, a set of statements, one of which is supposed to be supported by the others, it is in fact an argument. In the second example here about San Francisco, we can think about that a little bit. Yes, we do have multiple statements in that passage, but what distinguishes it from the first example, of course, is the fact that in the second example, none of those statements is supporting anything. They're not trying to prove anything. It's not as if 2 of the statements are providing evidence for one of the other statements. So in fact, the second example is not an argument. So in fact, as we'll learn in 1.2, the second example here would be described as loosely associated statements, and loosely associated statements are not arguments. So we'll introduce some very important terminology here for the course, and that would be premises and conclusions. So a premise is the statement, or the statements, if there's more than one, that support the others. In other words, a premise is the evidence for the other claim. And then the other claim, of course, would be called the conclusion. The conclusion is the claim being supported by the others. So any argument will be composed of a premise or multiple premises and a conclusion. Now, how are we going to be able to tell where the premises are, or where the conclusion is? Well, one thing we'll be able to note is the presence of conclusion and premise indicators in at least some arguments. And these are words or phrases that tell us where we will find an argument. Where we will find a particular component of an argument. So you can see these lists on page 3, kind of there in the middle of 1.1. There's a 3-column list there, first of all, of conclusion indicators. And these are words like therefore and thus, so, and others. And then after that, you'll see a 3-column list of premise indicators. And these are words like because and since and so on. Okay? And so what you want to know is that the indicators tell you where the premise or premises are and where the conclusion is. But it's very important here, the indicator words are not part of the premise or the conclusion. All right, so it's kind of like if you've driven some of the smaller highways in Washington State. Sometimes on the side of the road there will be a sign there that might say Goat Peak in the distance, right? That sign tells you what particular mountain you might be looking at. Well, we realize that the sign itself is not part of the mountain. It is simply telling us where that is. The same thing is true here of the conclusion and premise indicators. Conclusion and premise indicators are not part of the premise or the conclusion. They simply tell us where those are. And this is going to be important because one of your tasks in the class will be, on the exam, in fact, on the first section on that exam, will give you a whole bunch of passages, and your task will be to identify if it's an argument or not, and we'll talk more about why it might not be an argument when we look at 1.2. And if it is an argument, to tell me where the premise or the premises and the conclusion is. And you can do that simply by circling those components in the passage. But what you don't want to circle, and here's my point, you don't want to circle the indicator words. You don't want to circle thus or because. Those are signs telling you where the premise or the conclusion might be found, but they aren't actually part of those things. All right. Yes, I pushed the wrong button here. Well, there we go. We'll look at some more examples to illustrate these points. So here, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this is an argument. Bob was late today, thus because anyone who is late today will be fired, Bob will be fired. And so the question is, do we see any indicator words here, right? And so, in fact, we see the word thus, comma, because. And thus, comma, because would be a combination of a conclusion, comma, premise indicator. There are other combinations, just to give you a quick example. So, comma, since, right, would be another example of this kind of combination, and there are others that come up fairly frequently. When you see that kind of combination, what you will find is that immediately after the premise indicator, because, so starting with the word anyone here, we have a premise. So a premise here would be anyone who is late today will be fired. And then if the sentence is written in a grammatically correct fashion, you'll have a comma, as we see here. And then after that comma, we'll have the conclusion indicator essentially applying. And so Bob will be fired is our conclusion. Now, of course, to get to the conclusion that Bob will be fired, we also need to know that Bob was late today, and so that, in fact, is another premise. So this argument has two premises, and our conclusion is Bob will be fired. One other example. Mary works on the high seas since she's a sailor, and all sailors work on the high seas. Now here, as I've already written on the screen here, since is obviously a premise indicator. But do notice that the word since, as is also the case with other premise indicators, since has multiple meanings. You could use the word since in a temporal sense. I could say, I've been awake since 8 this morning. That's not a premise indicator in that case. So since will be a premise indicator only when it's being used interchangeably with the word because. And that's the case here, right? We could replace the word since here with because, and it would have the same meaning. And of course, what that tells us is that she marries a sailor and all sailors work on the high seas. That is where our premise or premises will be found. Now, is it one premise or is it two premises? Either way, okay? You can either look at it as a compound premise with and, or you can separate, obviously, those two components into two separate statements as two premises. Either way would be fine. You'll end up on the exam, right? You'll just be circling that section and labeling it with a P. That, of course, leaves Mary works on the high seas as our conclusion, and you would circle that and label it with a C. The word since, we don't circle that at all. We leave that out because that's an indicator word. All right, one more example here, and that would be George W. Bush should not have been president. He would not condemn torture. He was not skilled enough to lead the country. Now, obviously, this, if we're playing the which one of these things is not like the other game, this would be the one that stands out as different. And I made it intentionally different. It is somewhat politically charged, and that's to make a couple points. First of all, it gives me an opportunity to tell you that throughout the quarter, I'll be making reference to various political figures from time to time, and I assure you my goal here is not to get you to vote the right way in any given election. It's just because you've heard of these people, so it just gives you something to latch on to. It makes more sense that way. Also, though, this example here is particularly politically charged, and I imagine that some of us might object to this argument. It allows me to make the point that when you object to an argument, when you disagree with the conclusion, though it can be emotionally difficult to somewhat separate yourself from the content of the argument, it's actually even more important for those people to be able to identify the premise or premises and the conclusion. Because if you disagree with the conclusion, you probably want to argue against it. And that will be easier for you to do if we're able to identify the conclusion and the premises. So in this case, do we find any indicator words? And in fact, we don't, right? There aren't any here. Nonetheless, right, I think it's pretty obvious that it's this first statement in the passage that is the conclusion. That's what they're trying to prove, right? And that these other two are the premises. So sometimes we don't even need to have indicator words to know that we're dealing with an argument and to find the conclusion and the premise or premises. You might also be kind of itching to sort of start to evaluate this as either maybe you're saying, oh, this is a good argument, or no, it's a bad argument. And I will just say, if you have that inclination at this point, hold off a little bit. When we get to 1.4 soon, we'll talk about how do we actually evaluate arguments and decide if they're good or bad.